Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 52nd episode of the PB Political Podcast. I'm Eshan Pokhrel,
I'm Michael Bodeker.
and today we're here covering the Lincoln years in our Road to 2024 series. This is the elections of 1860 and 1864, and this one's a little interesting to cover because we're not going to focus on the Civil War itself. We're going to focus more on Lincoln's leadership as a president and the whole political landscape and the rise of the Republican Party, really. Because I think that's what Lincoln really characterizes in the eyes of a lot of people. And last week we talked about how the Republicans were just getting started, and like even as they were just getting started, they were already winning governorships and seats in Congress and stuff. But now it gets accelerated because the country is in complete shambles, in large part thanks to our favorite president, James Buchanan. This leads to the rise of the Republican Party and also the start of the Civil War, which has already kind of started, I guess, back in the 50s, in the 1850s. There were already like little rumblings, but now we're really in it now. So let's just, before we get into the election, Bodeker, you want to set the stage for who Lincoln was politically, at least?
Well, as we progress in these, we kind of see the progression of elections in American history and just the story of the country. We see kind of some of the best presidents and some mediocre ones in the first years. Washington's obviously up there. Adams is probably mediocre, average to below average. Jefferson's one of the best. Madison is probably one of the better ones as well. Monroe, John Quincy Adams, I would probably argue average to below average as well. Jackson, depending on how you feel about Jackson, is either one of the better ones or one of the worst ones. And then we kind of start a string of Buren up to average to below average. Harrison, can't tell because he died.
Rest in peace.
John Tyler, I would say average to above average as a president. And then we just kind of start a string of compromise and sectional divide and kind of putting band-aids on bullet holes. With Taylor all the way through Buchanan, it's just a disaster. And so we talked the last episode about a lot of the regional divide, the party divide, the Whigs dissolve, and so the Republicans form. Lincoln, obviously one-term member of the House, was in Congress. Really strange, actually, for this time to be a one-term member but holds so much political influence. I think that says a lot about the man Lincoln was. But a lot of the 1850s, that decade, Lincoln spends kind of kind of behind the scenes, influencing the Republican Party and the way it's formed, and kind of this grassroots effort to make the party a national force. And they obviously they put Fremont on the ballot in 1856. That was their first presidential election. I'd say they did pretty well for a new party. I don't know how you feel, but I think they did pretty well. And then 1860, this is the one that we even talked last time about it. They really wanted to win.
Yeah, I think they did really well as a party. I think they were really. They won 3 governorships like 2 years into their party. They won like 13 seats in Congress. Not bad at all for a new party.
So Lincoln, obviously, this is a 4-way race as well, which, if the Democrats, if they really hated Lincoln so much, they did a really bad job at stopping him from being president. That's just personally how I feel. We'll talk about this later, but just the divided Democratic convention basically paves the way for Lincoln to win this. Because I don't know how you feel, but I think if there was a unified Democratic convention, I don't think Lincoln wins.
I think it's possible. I just the problem with that is that it was literally impossible to have that. There was no way that would have existed, and I think Lincoln got it because I still find it crazy. Lincoln was a one-term member of the House, and he was only in the House in the 1840s, so he wasn't even in elected politics for the entire decade.
15.
Yeah, and obviously he had and I think what really raised his stock was the really famous, probably the most important Senate campaign in history, the 1858 election in Illinois between him and Stephen A. Douglas. Obviously, the Lincoln-Douglas debates came out of that. Those are probably the most influential political discourse since, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for the American public, I would say, honestly. Because, LD debates are something that people do in high school still, like debates. LD debates are pretty big. It's a very important form of communication. And we should probably mention this. So, like, Senate elections before the 17th Amendment were not elected. They were not popular votes. So Lincoln actually, I believe he won the popular vote in this election, but before the 17th Amendment, which was the 1900s, I believe, the Senate was elected. You were elected by the state legislature. So, like, for example, Illinois state house, I believe, and the state Senate would vote to send like who they want. And while Lincoln won the popular vote, the Illinois state legislature was Democratic, and they voted Stephen Douglas through, and he became a senator. So that's why he lost. But those debates and that campaign probably honestly provided a platform for him to get his name out there, and he was smart about it. And that's really where, even though he was only in office for 2 years ever before, he still had a national profile. And like I was saying, he was smart about this. He, like, after he lost, he was always thinking about running for president, and he made sure that those debates, like the transcripts, were published and a biography was published. So he was like, the instincts he had to get his like name out there to everybody, get the biography out there, were actually very smart moves, I would say. I think that's something that a lot of people do now. You see a lot of book tours before people run for president, but they don't really mean as much, I feel like, now, because no one's really reading books as much as they did back then. Like, that's all you could read. You didn't have like technology to immerse yourself in. So that was a really smart move from him. But let's get into the convention for the Republican side. Well, I could take us away.
This is, again, a really interesting, just finding out candidates in primaries this time. Just really interesting characters. Senator William Seward from New York. Seward actually was a major political player at the time. I think that's underplayed in history, at least the way a lot of people talk about it. Seward, and honestly, he really wanted to run for president. He was bummed that he didn't win this nomination, and I think he kind of reluctantly acquiesced to accepting the offer to be Secretary of State. But honestly goes on to be a pretty effective Secretary of State. And obviously, Seward's folly, Alaska, I mean, he has a lasting impact on American history, even though he wasn't president. He's done a lot of things. Governor Salmon Chase for Ohio. Turns out that he ended up being I believe the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this is his, I think, at least second convention we've seen him trying to run for president. So just very interesting, the dynamics of that at the time. Former Representative Edward Bates of Missouri, probably more of a unity guy, considering he was probably from a more southern state. Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, McLean, running again. I guess he really wanted to be president. Don't know why. But yeah, Seward was the early leader. Lincoln was really in second place. But the other candidates alienated key factions. So so that really made this a 2-horse race. But Lincoln was smart. He didn't go to the convention, but it was in Chicago, and so he worked on being the second choice for a lot of candidates. So being that second choice, sometimes if no one can agree on that first choice, then they go for the second choice, and that was Lincoln. And so he was really smart about the way he pulled that off.
Yeah, I think his political instincts were top notch. I mean, starting from the book tour thing, like, that's really smart to get his name out there at such a time. And then going into the convention, knowing that Seward would probably win the first ballot, but he would not win the ticket just because of how divided that the candidates were and everything. Very smart move. He also worked together in Chicago, his home state. Even though he's from Kentucky, his home state in politics. So smart move from Lincoln. Moving to the Democratic side, there's 4 candidates in this race, so we'll go into the Democrats real quick. Wasn't much really going on here. Like, I mean, there was a lot of ballots, but there's really no noteworthy happening. So Stephen A. Douglas, Senator from Illinois, Senator from Oregon, Joseph Lane, and Senator from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who will come back up in a little bit, were the main candidates. 50 Southern Democrats walked out over the platform dispute because they didn't want really like a mention of slavery. And Stephen A. Douglas wasn't really pro-slavery. He's like a Northern Democrat, a little bit of a conflict. And this actually led to the Southern Democratic Party also being a factor in this election. So It took 59 ballots to nominate Stephen A. Douglas because he was really close on most of them, but he didn't cross the line, and eventually crossed the line. And Senator Benjamin Fitzpatrick from Alabama was offered the vice presidency. He refused it. And then former Senator and former Governor Herschel Johnson from Georgia accepted it. So not too much drama there. And the people that walked out, they formed the Southern Democratic Party, led by Vice President at the time, John Breckinridge. He was Vice President? Yeah, he was Buchanan's Vice President. Yeah, and this party was much more ignoring the slavery topic compared to the Democrat. I mean, like, the Democrats weren't like abolish like anti-slavery, but they also, like they weren't gonna like advocate for slavery from what I can tell. And the Southern Democrats were just like a little bit more of a radical group of Democrats. Weirdly, Joseph Lane, the senator who ran for the Democratic Party, accepted the vice presidency for this ticket, which I find kind of odd, which is just kind of weird. And like, I don't know, so it was Breckinridge and Lane on that ticket. And then finally, the Constitutional Union Party with John Bell, senator from Tennessee, he was nominated. They were just about preserving the Union. They're formed by the factions of Know Nothings and Whigs, so a little bit of a blast from the past. And they just didn't really talk about slavery at all. John Bell actually opposed Kansas, Nebraska, and the Lecompton Constitution, which is the Bleeding Kansas issue, the pro-slavery side, the Bleeding Kansas. He opposed both of those. And Everett was Secretary of State under Millard Fillmore. So those are the candidates. And I mean, a lot of division. I think not facing the slavery head on was kind of a mistake, because like at this point it's like, you have to mention it. I don't know. What do you think about these four candidates and just like the division among everybody?
I think you're right, actually, that the Democrats, their split at the convention was inevitable. I think that's actually a really good point, because I don't see any way they were going to rectify the issue of slavery. I think that was such a difficult thing for their party to see. But it also confuses me, though, to a certain extent, because they had arguably, like in modern politics, we always talk about like, voting for the lesser evil whenever there's an election with candidates we don't like. Heard that a lot in 2016 and 2020.
Yeah.
And so like, for example, right, with Democrats in 2020, like, I don't think Joe Biden was the main choice for probably 90 to 95% of the party.
Yeah.
I think that everyone else had a different option. But they chose the electability of Joe Biden, or perceived electability of Joe Biden, unified that party. And so I just struggle with it shows how big of an issue slavery was, that the Democratic Party couldn't unify around somebody to just prevent Lincoln from being president.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I think that's the way everything's changed. I think that slavery was just too contentious of a topic, maybe. And I mean, the people that walked out were like extremely pro-slavery, like William Yancey, who he's from Alabama, actually. I think he's a real slavery defender, not a good guy at all. But yeah, those guys that walked out, I think were not gonna compromise on it. And yeah, and you can see factions of that, and nowhere near the same issue set, but like you can see like people on like in the 2010 Tea Party wave, those guys got everything they wanted, and there wasn't a lot of them, and they were just firm and they weren't compromising, and that was good for them, because like on the other side you have like progressives on the Democratic the left side of the Democratic Party will always cave to the establishment, even though they could do the same thing the Tea Party does and just hold their ground, which is what the Southern Democrats did here. They held their ground, and it didn't work out for them in the end, but they'd rather hold their ground than vote for a compromise candidate. That's what the Tea Party did. I don't know why progressives won't do that. And again, these are completely different like issue sets, but it's the same like politicking, I guess. But it's
smarter though, because they recognize that maybe that at least electing someone that they partially agree with is better than electing someone that they totally disagree with. So I think that's probably why.
That's true. Regardless, they didn't do that, so they had their own candidate. So this election was kind of just shows the testament of the North's power at this point. Like, I mean, it was kind of, so Lincoln was actually absent from 10 states' ballots. So, like, all the southern states except Virginia, he was not. All the states that ended up seceding from the Union except Virginia, he was not on those ballots. He only won 1,000 votes in Virginia, or 1,000, almost 2,000. He carried 18 states. So, and the lowest, like the southernmost state he carried outside of California, because it's like south, is Illinois. So it was a very north versus south election. That being said, Lincoln only, Stephen Douglas still won about 30% of the popular vote. Lincoln only won the election with 40% of the popular vote. He had a electoral majority, which was, like, thank God, because the whole like strategy was basically to force a contingent election where Lincoln would not have had the votes in Congress because there weren't enough Republicans in Congress until that election. So until 1860, there were not enough Republicans in Congress that if they had forced a contingent election, Lincoln would have been elected president. It would have probably been Stephen Douglas, I'm assuming, at that point. So that was like kind of the goal in for candidates. But also, and I think we should mention this, the South actually wasn't really, even though they all voted, they ended up all giving their electoral votes to Breckinridge for the most part. I think, yeah, all of them get, except Tennessee. They all went to Breckinridge and Virginia and Kentucky, which Kentucky didn't secede, though. So Virginia and Tennessee. While they all voted for Breckinridge, the divide was like, the Lincoln, like the Bell, Douglas and Lincoln divide there was very evident. And not really Lincoln in most states, but Bell and Douglas really split the pro-union, like preserving the Union votes, so much to where Breckinridge was able to win election votes in there, because Breckinridge only won 18.1% of the popular vote, but with the divide of Douglas and Bell splitting those states, he was able to win the plurality and then win the electoral votes, which I find really interesting, because the perception is always that like the South was like gung ho on voting for Breckinridge or voting for the pro-slavery candidate. And obviously they ended up seceding. So, I mean, but it's kind of interesting when you dive into like the math that they actually did want to, it seems like the math seemed like the preserving the Union was like kind of the goal. It's just the issue of who they would vote for to get that done is what's led to this. Outside, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, and I mean, turnout was 81%, really high, second highest at that point. And election of 1776 or 1876, which was an interesting one as well, was the only one that's higher ever in history. But yeah, and Lincoln was the only second president-elect to win while winning 0 votes in the state, and that was 10 states. He won 0 votes in it. And John Quincy Adams was the first. He didn't win any votes in 2 states, but a wild election. And let's get into the Lincoln years itself, because obviously now, after this, before the inauguration, the secession begins. And let's just talk about a little bit of Lincoln's ability as a leader throughout the first term. I don't know where you can start. I don't really know where to start with that one.
You got it. Go ahead, boss.
All right. Well, I don't really know where to start, but he comes into the election, or comes into the presidency with a war, because they secede before he gets inaugurated. I think it was one general. I think it was Winfield Scott. He advised Lincoln to actually take over as commander-in-chief before the election, or before the inauguration, which obviously he didn't do. Also, I don't think he could do that, so that was good to avoid a constitutional crisis there. But secession has happened. I don't even know, like, I don't envy Lincoln at all. I don't think anybody does for being in this. And because going into, like, because I'm sure he knew that there'd be a war. Like, I'm sure that was, like, kind of inevitable, right? Like, going into the election, like, no, like, you win, and then you're like, okay, yeah, now you have to prepare to, like, you should be, like, a wartime president from the whole get-go. And I don't even know. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's a mess. You know what also I find really interesting is that Stephen Douglas actually passes away I believe in June of 1861.
Oh, really?
Yep. So I'd actually never known that before looking that up. But Stephen Douglas passes away within the first 6 months of Lincoln's term.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Coincidentally, passed away on June 3rd, 1861, on the same day as the Battle of Philippi, the first skirmish of the American Civil War.
He was 48 when he died. Wow. Interesting. That's unfortunate. I did not know that. But, yeah.
So, I mean, and I think the thing that people underestimate is that Douglas was a political titan at this time. He really was. And it's really interesting. There's a whole thing here on his position on slavery is just very complicated. Because Douglas really fought Buchanan on the slavery issue, and so Douglas is kind of partially. I would say Douglas is a big reason of why Lincoln wins.
Oh, yeah.
Even the major reason.
Yeah, I mean, Douglas, like I was saying, Douglas and Bell really split those actually, that certainly helped him win, but I think Douglas he definitely had like a lack of regard for the party platform, for the better, I guess, morally. And that's something that people really respected of him. Because, like, he was a Democrat, but, like, at that time, obviously, being a Democrat typically meant you were pro-slavery. Yep. Wasn't really that, which is always noble, I guess, to break from your party. And, yeah. I think we need to mention, just quickly, shout out to Hannibal Hamlin for being vice president. Just because the name's cool. He was from Maine. But he is, I don't know why they chose him. I'm not really sure. Oh, I guess because
he was also a big anti-slavery guy.
That's true.
You know what I also find really funny and really ironic, and we talked about this before, is that in Statuary Hall in Congress, in the Capitol building, Hannibal Hamlin has a statue from Maine, of course, and then on the floor in Statuary Hall, they have little gold plates on the ground where all of the former presidents that sat in the old House chamber where their desks were. And I really do think that somebody planned it, but Hannibal Hamlin's statue looks down on Andrew Johnson's little gold plaque on the desk. And I think I think someone did that on purpose, but I do think it's ironic. And I think that, I don't know how you feel, but I do think the country would be a better place had Hannibal Hamlin been chosen again in 1864.
And yeah, Hamlin wasn't like a great friend of Lincoln. They weren't like really close or anything. So it seems like apparently he was kind of indifferent to being vice president again. That being said, I think anybody would have been better than Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was obviously only chosen to just appeal to the Southern like Unionists at the time. Because I mean, again, the Southern states couldn't even vote. Like there was no like, so it was like, yeah. I think it was a mistake. While the idea of a union party is always cool, and we'll go into this soon, but I think that Hamlin would have definitely been a better president for sure than Andrew Johnson, who literally is the closest anyone's ever gotten to getting impeached.
He is. I would probably argue Johnson's the second worst president in American history.
It might be. It really might be. These Civil War presidents are really bad for the most part. This era.
Yeah, he was just a disaster, and thankfully there was Grant after him.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And I feel bad for Grant because Grant's a severely underrated president. I don't think we'll cover Grant in this series, but Grant gets a lot of hate because I think a lot of his cabinet was corrupt and incompetent, maybe a little bit both.
Yeah.
But Grant himself was an effective leader.
We'll go into
I want to read Grant's memoirs. That's a story for another day.
We'll talk. We're going to go into the 1876 from here, so we won't cover Grant. But but Lincoln as a president, he had probably the toughest presidency of anybody, just because he's going to a war, not just a war, he's going to war against half the country, so it's kind of a mess. He was always trying to get they were always evading assassination. He's kind of he was moving mad for a little bit there. And he wasn't exactly, personally, he wasn't like a abolitionist or anything. I mean, he was against the expansion of slavery. That's the most key part. And he planned on banning expansions of slavery anywhere, like in new territories or anything. And that was an issue. He said that we can't be enemies or something. We must not be enemies, I believe, during his inauguration speech. Obviously, they were already seceded at that point. Not great. It's not good. I mean, everything's pretty bad. Strategy, you can talk about the war all you want, but presidentially, obviously, the Gettysburg Address, big point. Emancipation Proclamation, huge.
Although largely symbolic. But...
Yeah, largely symbolic, obviously. Promoting Grant, great move. Obviously, McClellan was relieved of his duties, and then that really kind of leads into like, because a lot of this is just war. I mean, there wasn't really much else going on. He used to suspend habeas corpus. I think constitutional people have a little bit of an issue with that, or like law freaks, law hawks have a little bit of an issue with that. But overall, I would say everyone rates him easily top 5, top 10 president, just for his ability to keep his statesmanship, I guess, is what really, yeah, I think that's...
He's top 3. There's nowhere below top 3. He's probably 1 or 2, depending on how you feel about him, but just an unbelievably effective leader. Just a leader that I think a lot of presidents have tried to be, and I think many, if not all, have failed to be. I also think it's actually, I'm looking at this really interesting kind of a rabbit hole, but John McClain, the Supreme Court justice that had run for president like twice or 3 times, actually died in 1861 as well.
Yeah, and I mean, Lincoln appointed Salmon Chase, I believe. I don't know if he definitely...
Roger Taney in 1864. Roger Taney, a complicated legacy for him. The successor to John Marshall, but...
Yeah. And I mean, he appointed Salmon Chase after he won election in 1864. And Salmon Chase, and this is where we can probably just move into 1864. Salmon Chase is a pretty big, in that election, he's kind of a critic of Lincoln. He didn't run against him. He did run in 1860, but he didn't run against him here. I think he ran a couple of times before that too. But 1864 election, I mean, Lincoln wasn't going to lose. There was kind of like, and that's mainly because there was there was no opposition from there was no pro-slavery candidate here. George McClellan, the general, was the Democratic candidate. It wasn't a tough election. Lincoln had light opposition. The biggest thing of this election is that the Republicans decided to have a national union party. They removed Hannibal Hamlin from the ticket. Seems to be amicably, and then selected Senator Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. That's unfortunate. Rip Hannibal Hamlin, because I think, like we said earlier, he would have been a better president if we had known what would have happened. The Democratic side, it's so divided still. There's Copperheads, and then there's the War Democrats. Copperheads are just fine with, appeasing the South, just keeping the battle lines as they are. The War Democrats, meanwhile, are trying to the War Democrats are like the pro-Union Democrats, I guess you can say, really, and bringing the Union back together. McClellan, the party actually adopted the Copperhead platform. That being said, McClellan just completely bucked that. I don't know what McClellan was really hoping here to win. I don't know what the. I think it's kind of an unfair strategy to have if you're a real wartime president, you don't lose. It's kind of a historical fact. I don't know what McClellan what do you think McClellan's ambitions were for president here? Because he wanted vice president, turns out, but. He was candidate for president. Do you really think there was do you think he thought there was a real chance at winning?
So I think that and Lincoln says this on himself too. Lincoln was scared he was going to lose. But I think that's more because of the presence of John C. Fremont than it was because of McClellan himself. Because I think everyone kind of realized that the presence of Fremont on the ballot, because Fremont was also a major political player at this time that doesn't get talked about much. But Fremont, his presence, I think, would have really helped split Republican votes and could have done something for McClellan. But Fremont and Lincoln both, I think, knew this, and so they both said, and Fremont said, no, I'm going to drop out and support Lincoln. I think the victory in the war is more important than
Yeah.
It's like don't leave your horse in the stream. Like don't change horses down a stream in the middle of a stream. Kind of that mentality. And everybody agreed on it, and that was how it went. And Lincoln wins in a landslide. So it was really interesting. And I think there's also just, I guess, getting back to Lincoln's presidency, there's some really interesting policy that I don't think people talk about with Lincoln. Lincoln actually, he was alive for the proposition of the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery. And then Lincoln, obviously because of the Southern secession, had huge Republican majorities. So this was the time when he was actually convinced that he could permanently abolish slavery in the United States, and that was really powerful. Lincoln also only vetoes 4 bills that his entire presidency. Very interesting. Also, people don't know this. Lincoln, Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1861, which is the first federal income tax in the history of the United States. 3%. Which we could get back there. Also signed in some tariffs. Also authorized the minting of $150 million worth of greenbacks, paper banknotes, first banknotes issued by the federal government since the end of the American Revolution. Very interesting. Revenue Act of 1862, excise tax on nearly every commodity, as well as the first national inheritance tax. The Revenue Act of 1862 also adds a progressive tax, the federal income tax. So basically, Lincoln basically starts the IRS. Love Lincoln. That one's an interesting one. Also, it's really important to talk about the Homestead Act.
Oh yeah,
Homestead
true.
Act is
Yeah.
huge important act.
Mm-hmm.
That basically sets the stage for, I think, a lot of people moving west. The Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act in 1862, government grants for agricultural colleges in each state. Also, Lincoln's responsible for basically the institution of the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. Just a very interesting presidency, just getting away from his wartime policy. He selected a lot of top diplomats. The Trent Affair, looking into the Trent Affair, this is a really interesting thing. A diplomatic incident in 1861 during the American Civil War that threatened a war between the U.S. and Great Britain. The U.S. Navy captured 2 Confederate envoys from a British Royal Mail steamer, and the British government protested this vehemently. Washington ended the incident by releasing the envoys. Really interesting. So that could have been an absolute nightmare. And I think that could have, had that gone differently, that could have lent British support for the Confederacy.
Yeah.
Which, that would have been crazy. Just a really interesting dynamic of Lincoln's presidency. And then I guess moving to 1854 or 1864.
Yeah.
Just, there's a lot of different dynamics to this. I don't think by election time, McClellan had no chance. With the withdrawal of Fremont, the developments of the war just in general, Battle of Atlanta happened, Sherman's doing his march to the sea during this time. There's 3 new states in this election: Kansas, West Virginia, and Nevada. It's just a lot of soldiers are voting. They're all voting for Lincoln. They were loyal to Lincoln. Was just no chance of McClellan winning by election day. Maybe six months before, a year before, not by election day.
Yeah, and I like to I think Fremont, who he did withdraw pretty reluctantly, and it was kind of a compromise in his withdraw. Lincoln removed sort of from his cabinet. I think Fremont actually gets he's kind of underrated as a figure in Western American politics. He was a very big abolitionist. He actually unilaterally, when he was a general in the Civil War, abolished, I don't know how this worked, but he freed slaves in Missouri when he was a general in the Western campaign in the Civil War. And I think that he kind of gets a bad rap just for everything. there's a lot of controversy in California when he was governor there, and that kind of led to him losing his own state when he ran for president. But I think he gets a bad rap. I just want to mention that. Shout outs of John Fremont. For in the end, I think he was a very important figure that doesn't get talked about enough, just for his like impact on Western American politics, the westward expansion of the United States. But his like withdrawal leads to Lincoln's victory. Lincoln actually became the first president since Andrew Jackson to win a consecutive term, which is kind of crazy. There had been one terms and like dead presidents since that. It was kind of a strange little run we had there. But I think this also solidifies the Republican Party, and that's something that we really need to talk. The Republican Party becomes like the party after this election, or the National Union Party, but the Republican Party. They're firmly in the driver's seat from here. They actually had an insane margin in the House of Representatives. I don't even know how many seats they had. Like I can't even count this. If you look at the graph of the seats, like the seat charting, there's like 20 maybe seats for Democrats in the House of Representatives, and that's obviously because the southern states weren't in the Union, which made this election kind of move.
16, 21.
21, yeah, it's crazy. And I don't think that there's no point Democrats had in running this campaign, because like if you don't have a real candidate, then it's like if you're not fighting a big issue set here, you're not going to beat a wartime president. And yeah, McClellan just got wiped, and Lincoln.
What's interesting though? Do you know the popular vote margin actually is really interesting to me. It's almost Lincoln won by almost 10%, which
that's less than I expected.
Is crazy.
That's actually less than I expected, I will say.
Yeah, me too. I'd never seen that margin before.
And there's obviously been some where it's like insane. Like there's been like the Reagan. I believe it was Reagan. He won by a huge amount. There's been some crazy popular vote margins, but I don't know. I think I'm trying to see where McClellan made that number up. Like McClellan making that, I don't know where he made them. Okay, so Lincoln won by like. Okay, yeah, it was kind of close actually. He won overwhelming. He won by more than 20 points in Kansas, Vermont, Massachusetts, Missouri, West Virginia, Iowa, and Rhode Island. Everywhere else, and he was within 10 in a lot of these states. So, kind of close comparatively. I figured it'd be more actually than 10%. Yeah. But yeah, because I mean, if you look at FDR later on, FDR just destroys everybody.
Yeah,
that's probably the best. Yeah, that's probably the best example. FDR probably the best one. And maybe
we talk about like the domination of the Republican Party. They pretty much dominate from 1860 to I would say 1932.
Yeah,
FDR takes 32, with the exception of 2 terms of Woodrow Wilson and 2 terms of Grover Cleveland.
Non-consecutive, of course.
Non-consecutive. So it's what? 16 years of Democratic presidents.
Yeah. Okay. Like in
56 of Republican presidents.
In 1936, FDR won with a 24-point win in the popular vote, 60% to 36. That's crazy. 24 points.
Rest in peace, my buddy Alf Landon.
Yeah, Alf Landon. What a Chad. But yeah, so Lincoln was doing unprecedented. He did win convincingly. I think it's fair to say. That being said, like 1 or 2 months in, he gets, we all know he gets shot, and that leads to our second favorite president. Andrew Johnson, the senator from Tennessee, who this really backfired for the National Union Party. Let's just say they were doing the noble thing, I guess, and nominated Andrew Johnson seemingly out of fear, because Lincoln was kind of scared he'd lose this election. I guess it was kind of out of fear that they'd lose the Southern Union voters. So they nominate Andrew Johnson. Of course, the worst thing possible happens. Lincoln gets shot in the head and he dies. And that leads to the elevation of Andrew Johnson as our president. And I mean, we can get into the Johnson years. We need to get into the Johnson years because this is one of the worst. Like, after the success of winning the Civil War, we go right back into 1856 with Andrew Johnson.
Yep. It's just, Um, Johnson, Southern sympathizer to a pretty large degree.
Yep.
Pro-union but Southern sympathizer, kind of complicated legacy. Basically allows black codes, allows Jim Crow to begin in the South. I mean, it's just a disaster. I mean, there is a federal occupation. I think there's even an argument that, like, the Compromise of 1876 that ends Reconstruction is almost as bad of a decision as Johnson himself. But just an absolute nightmare. Johnson. Is there anyone like other than like historians that can name one important piece of post-war? I mean, I guess
there's one big thing that Congress did in this Johnson presidency. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, which Johnson hated, so that kept all of Lincoln's appointments in the cabinet, and he wasn't able to remove them because he could remove candidates beforehand. But now this isn't possible, and that really, I mean, like, for everything Johnson did, this would have been much, much worse if Johnson was able to just remove cabinet officials from his cabinet that Lincoln selected, because that majority was so big that, like, they couldn't, obviously they couldn't really.
So yeah, Johnson, a disaster. Basically, he not destroys Lincoln's legacy. Lincoln's legacy is untarnishable, I would say.
I'd say so, yeah.
But Johnson does his best to just stop all the progress.
Yeah.
The 14th and 15th Amendments are passed during his presidency, I believe.
Yeah, fortunately. He hated the 14th Amendment, and it passed, thankfully.
But Johnson, a disaster.
And
the second worst president in American history.
And Johnson, he was impeached by the House of Representatives. And obviously since then, how many presidents have we had impeached since Johnson? Clinton. Was he impeached? Clinton was impeached, right?
Clinton was impeached.
Trump was impeached twice, not convicted. Biden, they're looking at impeachment inquiries for a president. Biden now possibly in the House, which could be interesting. Obviously, that's far from materializing. That could be a potential. So it could be the fifth impeachment. But Johnson not only got impeached, he was one vote in the Senate away from being removed. So I can't remember. There was a lot of different things. He was like, his impeachment was, he got impeached on, like, I think on high crimes and misdemeanors, 11 articles of impeachment against him. The primary one was the Tenure of Office Act thing, because he tried, so they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which said that you can't really, like, fire cabinet officials because you haven't resigned. And he was pressuring Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to try to, like, get removed and replace him with another guy. And not even, like, he was trying to, like, he actually tried to replace Edwin Stanton while he was in office, which was the main issue. And it went. The Chief Justice is Salmon Chase at this point. Lincoln appointed him as the Chief Justice. The Senate, or the House, voted for it. The Senate, by one vote, failed to secure a 2/3 majority. And that was on the first vote. They came back 10 days later, and they voted on 2 more articles, and it matched it. So, and this gets into another crisis because there was no vice president. So I don't even know who was the Speaker of the House in this Congress. Like, we need to find that, because that would have elevated the Speaker of the House to president. Because Andrew Johnson had no vice president. It's just a mess. Let's find out. Who was the Speaker of the House during this time? Yeah. Speaker of the House was Schuyler Colfax, who ends up being vice president for Ulysses Grant, and ends up being, did he resign? He resigned, right? He wasn't impeached. Schuyler Colfax resigned for another scandal during the Grant years, which is all him. So there was a lot of things going on here, because, again, like, one vote away from being removed. That's the closest anyone's been to being removed from an impeachment trial, on different, like, 3 or 4 different cases too. So That would have elevated Schuyler Colfax from Speaker of the House to President, since there was no Vice President for Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's a mess. He actually did serve in the Senate after leaving. So he ran for president in 1868, but he didn't win. He lost quite badly. He wasn't popular, I would say, and he actually returned to Tennessee. He won a Senate race. He's the only president to serve in the Senate after becoming president. And yeah, I mean, I don't even know. What a mess. I think, yeah, it is spectacular that we had one of the best presidents of all time, Abraham Lincoln, followed by one of the worst. And I think that just actually just perfectly encapsulates the division in American politics in this time. And just because the war was over doesn't mean it was gone. Because he went from Lincoln, who united the nation again, to an extent. Obviously, mentally, there wasn't much unification, but geographically united the nation again, to Johnson, who actively tried to destroy it, I would say. And I think this is just, it's fascinating for that reason. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
You pretty much hit the nail on the head. I mean, again, Mayor, rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace. Well, that's everything. I mean, we don't want to we didn't really want to talk about the wars because we all know the history of the Civil War itself, conflict-wise. We wanted to talk about the rise of the Republicans. From here on out, it's like all Republican dominance until we get to Wilson, who we both love, obviously. But yeah, the Civil War years, the Lincoln years were definitely, I would say, some of the more influential of American history. They really set the tone for what Republicans wanted to get to moving forward with Grant and then Hayes and then whoever, McKinley and all that, and then Teddy Roosevelt, obviously. But I think this was a very trying time, and it's good that it worked out, I guess, in the end. Even though Reconstruction really messed up the South. We don't have to get into that Reconstruction era, but Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, Johnson's ability or want to just end Reconstruction really messed up millions of people and their futures, and that's not good. So, with all that being said, that's everything I have. I don't know if you have anything to add. But yeah,
that's pretty much it for me. I mean, just the next one's really interesting. I think an underrated presidential election.
I think so. 1876, for you guys that are wondering, that'll be the next one we do next week. We're always looking for guests to take breaks from these election episodes. So if you guys have any guest suggestions, or you can connect us to any guests, candidates for office, whoever, let us know. We've reached out to a couple of campaigns. We've gotten semi-good things back from them. We'll see if they can fit us into their schedules. Obviously, everything's heating up. Without campaigns, we're covering. We're over on pbpolitical.com. We got the election apparatus up and running. PB Political, AL, all of that stuff. We are going to be covering the election nonstop, basically, for the rest of 2023, 2024, and into the inauguration in 2025. A lot of stuff to cover. Debates coming up soon. Hopefully we can get passes to the Alabama GOP debate, which we're hoping that we'll get more info on soon. A lot of things going on. But all that being said, follow us on Instagram, listen to our podcast, share it, share the website, bookmark the website, because that's where a lot of the election stuff is going to go down. And if you guys want to know what's happening with the election, probably the most unfiltered and honest place you're going to get it will be our website. So, with all that being said, thank y'all for listening. I'm Eshan Pokhrel.
I'm Michael Bodeker.
And goodbye.